sock. And it went, as we say now, viral. And the rest was history. That's how we kind of learned that the media could be very, very important one way or the other. So on Occupy, you know, my judgment about the media and Occupy is different than the typical Occupy activist. I think that the New York Times, because it happened in New York, in the mainstream media, got all over the story unexpectedly. The number of articles written was unbelievable, the number of stories, and they were relatively favorable, far beyond what the Occupy movement was. It was an overreaction in favor of Occupy. Now, it's true that a typical activist in Occupy would not see it that way, and God bless them. They would see, we're being used, fuck the media, that's not the story, etc., etc., etc. But if you compare it to, say, Seattle, if you compare it to anything comparable, the media takeoff was relatively early and relatively large scale. And I think that was, it remains to be investigated why so many journalists and editors took that story. I don't know. Maybe that it's the left-wing media, as Bill O'Reilly would say. But I don't think so. I don't know why they took it. But then it is also true that the media soured on the Occupy movement. The lesson is that if your destiny is in the hands of the media, you are in fatal trouble. You will die by the media if you're born by the media. Which is not to say that the media shouldn't be cultivated and shouldn't, you know, compete in the marketplace to get the story out there. You know, but when they decide that it's over, it's over. If you've been living in the media realm, you will suddenly say, what's happening? You'll feel disempowered, but in fact, your power was artificial to begin with.
Does that mean that the ability to organize in the 60s was stronger because you didn't really need the media? And so now the organizations are dependent on the media to survive? Or?
I don't know. I mean, I think we're running against the narrative of the 60s right now, the Todd Gitlin narrative the whole world is watching. But I think if Todd was here, he would say that the media was a mixed blessing. I do know that the people like King and SCLC and later SNCC knew that they had to cultivate the media just for the survival of the civil rights workers. You had to say 3 missing in rural Mississippi and put that word out everywhere. And you had to compete for the narrative. They started to learn that. And they learned the power of photographs. You know, but it started before the media was covering it. The free speech movement, which will turn 50 in a year and a half, I believe started before the media covered it. It took off when they had to sit in at Berkeley on top of the car. That photograph that went viral. The anti-war movement took off with the media opposing it editorially. First demonstration was April of 1965, and it was criticized in the media and little covered. The draft resistance, similarly, the takeoff was before it was covered. But, you know, all these things ended in media coverage for better or worse. For example, in my trial, the conspiracy of the Chicago 8, by then, you're talking about September 68 through 70, the trial. And I had, you know, co-conspirators, Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman, who believed in Marshall McLuhan's theory that nothing is real unless it's on the media. And that And that all they had to do was get on TV, you know, with long hair and beads and crazy expressions, and it would subliminally reach young people and divide them from their parents. And I was against that. I thought it's true that will happen, but you will also antagonize 62% of the rest of the country, and you'll have no organization to follow through with all the teenagers who are strung out. I worked in Berkeley on a free clinic that was dealing with the dropouts and the kids who were on acid who hitchhiked to the Bay Area. They really needed crash pads, and the yippies weren't there with the crash pads. But it did, I mean, the trial was on television every night, it seemed, for 4 or 5 months. And it became legendary, and people drew their conclusions from what it looked like, you know. No, I got used to it. I've never liked it, but it became apparent that the media would choose, and you had to have a strategy to deal with the media's choice of you, and it had to be carefully thought out, and that you didn't have control over it, but it was very important to do so. Now, I would just generalize and say movements start before the media kicks in, but that it happens so rapidly now, you have to think of the media as being part of the launch. And if you say, we're not going to cover that, it doesn't matter, because somebody else in the media will cover it, and they'll beat you to it, and your editor is saying, what the hell's going on? Why did you cover that story? So it does, it grows by leaps and bounds now, whether we want it to or not. My concern is how you get the story straight. Because it never starts with established leaders, does it? It always starts in obscurity. And you got to go out and investigate. You got to ask a lot of people, what the hell happened? I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how the activists decided to shut down the WTO in Seattle, as opposed to protesting the WTO in Seattle. And I think I found the story. But a lot of people trusted me with confidential information, and I didn't publish the story, just wanted confirmation. And I think I found the actual individual who actually proposed to shut it down in a closed meeting in the Northwest. Then was picked up until everybody was picking it up. It's a very good story, but it's never really been written because people that do it, unless they want to be famous and get into trouble, they don't really tell you how it happened. And the people who know, if they're not going to write it, how would you get the story? And I think the same thing happened with Wall Street. For instance, in the declaration of September 17th of Occupy Wall Street, it said in the first sentence, the first principle of Occupy Wall Street is a clear and transparent participatory democracy. That's our demand. All right. Well, that phrase came from the Port Huron Statement 50 years before. Now, my question is, who wrote the two words participatory democracy and put them in the Statement of Principles? Or did it come from the crowd? Somebody just yell it out. Because the history of that phrase, participatory democracy, is very important to me. But I still don't know who wrote the sentence.
I was in Seattle covering that for the Wall Street Journal, the WTO protest, and we were just talking a little before you got in about the Black Bloc and the anarchists. So, I mean, from your investigation, what was the role of the Black Bloc in shutting it down?
Secondary. They were used by the movement and by police. But the big deal was when the AFL-CIO and the Teamsters agreed to shut it down. I think it was akin to a real Occupy, as opposed to a symbolic Occupy. words, if you occupied the streets in Seattle for 5 days, such that business could not be conducted, you would have a chance of stopping the WTO from passing regulations that were onerous to labor and environmentalists and so on. The Black Bloc actually brought discredit to the strategy by making it seem that it was only about window smashing. And some of the Black Bloc obviously are police. What really shut it down was the vast majority of the 50,000 people who wanted the city to be non-violently blocked until the delegates left town. That was doable when you think back about it. It was a small city, Seattle, and people had planes to catch back to the countries they came from. And they had to be put up in hotels. They had to get from hotels to convention centers. And so if you use the element of surprise and you blocked enough doors and enough street corners, they wouldn't be able to make it. You would just create like a traffic jam. It wasn't necessary to break any windows. What was necessary was to just completely, I didn't know this was coming. That's why I followed the story. I didn't know about these tactics which are now commonplace, where you can lock yourselves together, you can weld yourself together in such a way that unless the police have the right equipment, they cannot move you. You have like 20 people who are chained together and have their long tubes on their arms. You can't kill them. You can't pull their arms off. It takes an hour, half an hour, 2 hours to move them. By that time, the delegates have given up and are back drinking or having meetings, watching television in their rooms. And so all you got to do is get it to the end of the 4 or 5 days and you've done it. They've got to leave town. So that's what I think happened. Not the window breaking.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the, as someone who's an activist and a student and a journalist, I sort of struggle with how to balance my involvement in traditional institutions. And so obviously you were in the state legislature and writing for somewhat mainstream outlets. And so I guess I just wonder whether, I'm not as much worried about the CIA as sort of those daily institutional pressures that you're supposed to look at something a certain way and people just think you're weird or naive if you look at it differently. Yeah. And so I wonder how you balance that.
I don't work in mainstream institutions. I work on the edge. I was elected so the people could throw me out, but I didn't have a boss. My main success in life is I've lived my whole life without a boss. I had a boss on my paper route. I had a boss at a restaurant in college. Never had a boss. I've had teaching jobs, a semester here, a year there, so I'm under a department head. I'm a boss in that sense, but I'm not a permanent member of the faculty, so the boss can't do much since I'm leaving in 4 weeks or 16 weeks. So I can't. It's hard to help you. I pride myself on that independence, but I know there's a cost. It's a cost in your standard of living and all kinds of costs that come with it.
So you think that staying independent was the right decision and has had more benefit than cost?
It's too late to look back, but sure. It's not a cost-benefit thing. It's like you need to know what the price will be, and also everything is a surprise. You can't really predict how it's going to go. How did you know how Seattle was going to go? No idea. But I'll give you another example. I went to Miami to the FTAA. There's this thing in the 5-6 years ago. Right, where they wanted to impose neoliberal trade regulations on the 34 countries of Latin America. There's going to be a big building in Miami. There's going to be the head of Latin American corporate trade policies. And so there was this big conference, and the people on the streets wanted to duplicate Seattle. good lesson. Don't ever try to duplicate what was surprising to you before. You only can duplicate is surprise.
Well, yeah, that's the police came up with their
Yeah,
surprising
of course,
news.
you know, you say, wow, look what we did. Let's write it down, make it a formula, and do it again. That won't work. What happened is, I was teaching at the Harvard Institute of Politics, and I had some Harvard students and some MIT students. I was teaching a class on social movements, and I organized them to go to Miami as a demonstration. One of them had been in a protest before. It was about 15, 18 people. And I taught them participant observation. I got them to raise money from Harvard to pay for plane tickets. I got one young woman whose family knew people in Miami to get apartments. And off we went. I said, your job is you're going to be right in the middle of anarchism, right in the face of police, and you are not to participate in any committed way. You are to smell the tear gas, watch what's going on, keep careful notes, take photographs, and interview as many people as possible. We got to about 110. We got a 40 question questionnaire so that we can find out who these people are as opposed to what you may think or the media may think. Who are they? And they did a great job. They did a great job. But at the end, the Miami police gave an order that everybody leave this place. There was nothing going on. It was just an exhausting week. And they asked everybody to disperse, but they were wearing these big, heavy uniforms and loudspeakers and clubs and all this stuff. They were walking towards my students and about 50 other people. And my students are going like this, backing up. How's this for a slogan? We are dispersing. We are dispersing. It didn't work. Police swarmed them, noticed, swarmed them. Took them down, put pepper spray in their eyeballs, cuffed them. They missed me. I had one officer pointing his gun at their chest, and I'm a heart patient. I didn't really like dealing with that. Didn't pull the trigger. And we had one guy who was a African-American, tall, fit the stereotype of a dreadlocked militant. And they didn't touch him. He was standing there photographing his friends being blasted in the eyeballs with this pepper spray and being dragged away. Maybe the police thought he was one of them. I don't know what, but they missed him, or they were afraid. I don't know what it was. You don't notice these things unless all you're doing is watching. And then Harvard went nuts. Who authorized this? Who paid for it? I said, you did. Parents are calling. My child is ruined. And I had to get money to bail them out. Then they had this big debate. I told them what their options were. You know, they could plead guilty, they could plead not guilty. There were consequences, timelines. And then they had to go back to Harvard and present what had happened. They had to do a paper with individual testimony. And the place was really shaken up. And it was the most educational experience they will have ever had in their lives. But it was high risk. And one kid, white kid from Jersey, he said he grew up in the suburbs and the police were always in the background. A benign presence, no problem, just walked through life. But in 3 days in Miami, he had been absolutely terrorized down to his bones by the police and by the handcuffing and shackling and beatings and the jail experience. And he gave that report to the Harvard student body. And long discussion ensued about what are the ingredients of education, how do we educate. So as a reporter, if you've never been busted, gassed, imprisoned, not as a reporter, but as a kind of bystander where the police don't know who you are, you're missing something. I'm not advising you to do it. I'm just saying it doesn't guarantee anything. It's just you start to become like that student. You start to see how the other half lives. And it was helpful to them. I don't think any of them have been arrested since. their parents are fine. Harvard went down into Harvard legends. But it was an eye-opener for me, too. I don't think Occupy will come back. I think Obama will win the election, and then there'll be a huge uprising of protests all over the place. Because they won't wait for Obama for the next 4 years. They gave him the 4. They've got his back now. And as soon as it's over, they'll get in his face. But it won't be anarchist. It's too narrow. It won't be occupying little teeny parks. It'll be something else. I don't know what it will be. I'm not good on predictions, but that's in general. One reason I think it went away is that the presidential election took all the oxygen out of the room. People that don't like politics are upset about it, but there's nothing you can do about it. People are glued to the electoral process, and as soon as it's over, then I think we'll see. Yeah.